It began on a quiet afternoon deep in the woods, where sunlight filtered through the tall pine trees and the air carried the faint scent of earth and rain. Daniel Harris's cabin sat at the edge of a small lake, wooden and solid, the kind of place that looked untouched by time. He had built it himself years ago, not for luxury, but for peace. Every piece of timber, every nail, every lock on that gate represented the quiet life he had earned after years working long nights as a defense contractor. He didn't throw parties, didn't meddle in anyone's business, and paid his dues on time. He kept to himself. But to the wrong kind of person, that quiet independence looked like defiance. And in Oak Ridge Estates, there was one person who couldn't stand defiance, the HOA president, Karen Blake. Karen was the kind of woman who believed control meant order, and order meant power. Her sharp eyes missed nothing. If a mailbox leaned an inch off center, she noticed. If a lawn grew half an inch too high, she fined. Her clipboard was her weapon, her voice her siren. People in the community learned to nod, smile, and obey, because if Karen was displeased, you'd soon find an envelope on your door stamped in red, notice of violation. She'd fought with everyone at least once, except Daniel. And that bothered her more than anything. For months, she had driven past his private road, that small gravel turn leading into the woods, and every time she saw that padlocked gate, it made her furious. Who was he to lock out the HOA? What was he hiding? No one ever visited him, and he never came to community meetings. The other homeowners shrugged it off. That's just Daniel, he likes his privacy. But for Karen, privacy wasn't just odd, it was suspicious. She convinced herself that rules were being broken beyond that gate, and in her mind, rules mattered more than reason. That morning she stood before the board, holding her clipboard like a badge. "There's a property out there beyond our regulation," she announced. "He's blocking access with a lock. That's a direct violation of Section 14B, no barriers to inspection." One board member, an older man named Steve, tried to reason with her. "Karen, that cabin's outside the main HOA area. It's his private extension, remember?" But Karen only narrowed her eyes. "He pays HOA fees. If he's part of the community, then the community has a right to inspect." Nobody wanted to argue. They had seen what happened to those who did. By noon, she had already made up her mind. She'd do the inspection herself. She didn't bother informing anyone. She wanted to catch him red-handed. She grabbed her bolt cutters, her phone, and that same smug confidence that had carried her through years of bullying people into compliance. She got into her SUV and drove down the winding dirt road, her tires crunching over gravel, her jaw set tight. The trees grew thicker, the light dimmer, and as the cabin came into view, she felt a surge of triumph. "Finally," she muttered, pulling up beside the locked gate. The sign on the fence read, "Private property, no trespassing." She smirked. "Rules don't apply to me," she whispered under her breath. She stepped out, the forest silent around her except for the chirping of distant birds. The gate was sturdy, a thick chain looped through the metal, the lock shining in the sunlight. She took out her phone, recording herself as she always did when she wanted to feel official. "This is Karen Blake, HOA president of Oak Ridge Estates, conducting an unscheduled inspection for community safety." Her voice was cold, rehearsed, like she had said it 100 times before. She lifted the bolt cutters, clamped them around the lock, and squeezed until it snapped with a sharp metallic crack. The sound echoed through the forest. She pushed the gate open, the hinges groaning softly, and walked forward with a sense of authority that bordered on arrogance. The cabin was quiet, the windows dark. The front door was solid wood, with another lock, this time, a keypad. "Ridiculous," she muttered. "What's he hiding?" She tried the handle, found it locked, and rolled her eyes. "Fine," she said, pulling a smaller crowbar from her bag. "You brought this on yourself, Daniel." The door creaked open slowly, the hinges squealing as it moved. The air inside was cooler, still, and filled with the faint smell of oil and metal. At first, she saw nothing, just shadows, equipment boxes, and stacks of folded tarps. Then came the sound, a faint click, followed by the hum of electricity. Before she could step forward, a red dot appeared on her chest. Then another. And another. Her breath caught in her throat as she looked up, and froze. In front of her stood 3 armored men, rifles raised, helmets gleaming under the dim light. Behind them, another 2 appeared from the hallway, moving with precision, their weapons steady. "Hands up!" one shouted. Karen's mouth opened, but no sound came. What is this? Who are you?" she stammered. One man stepped forward, his vest marked with the word SWAT. "Identify yourself," he barked. Her knees trembled. I'm from the HOA, she said weakly. "I was just inspecting." "Inspecting?" the man repeated, his voice sharp. "You just broke into a federal training zone." She blinked, confused, her brain trying to catch up. "Federal? What?" He lowered his weapon slightly but didn't relax. "This area is under restricted use. You're trespassing on an active operation." Behind him, a woman in tactical gear whispered into her radio, "We have unauthorized civilian entry. Possible breach of training perimeter." Karen's heart pounded so hard she thought she might faint. No, I didn't know," she cried. "I thought, this is just a cabin." The officer looked at her like he was trying to understand if she was joking. "You cut the lock?" he asked. "Yes," she admitted. "Why?" She swallowed. "Because it violates HOA rules." The silence that followed was worse than shouting. The team exchanged looks, disbelief written all over their faces. "You're telling me," the lead officer said slowly, "you broke into a federal site because of a homeowner's rule?" She nodded weakly. He let out a long, exhausted sigh. He said. "You just interrupted a live training operation. You could have gotten yourself killed." Within minutes, she was surrounded by flashing lights and radio chatter. A black SUV pulled up outside, and 2 more officials stepped out, both wearing tactical jackets with the words Federal Operations Training Unit. They took her name, her ID, her statement, and every answer she gave sounded more ridiculous than the last. "It's an HOA matter," she kept repeating, as if saying it would make it true. The officer taking notes shook his head. This is federal land on temporary lease for training. You're lucky no one pulled that trigger." When Daniel arrived that evening, the entire area was sealed with yellow tape. He had been at work when his phone buzzed with 20 missed calls from local law enforcement. As he drove closer, the sight stopped him cold. Squad cars, tactical vans, and a crowd of stunned neighbors whispering near the road. The sun was setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across the scene. An officer approached him. "Mr. Harris." Daniel nodded. "We've contained the situation. You're clued." "What happened?" he asked, already guessing the answer. The officer glanced toward the SUV where Karen sat, her face pale and her hands cuffed in front of her. "She broke into your property during an active SWAT exercise. We thought it was an intruder." Daniel's jaw tightened, though his expression stayed calm. He walked slowly toward the cabin. The officer followed. "We'll file a full report," the officer said. "For now, she's being charged with unlawful entry." Daniel looked at the broken lock hanging on the gate, the fresh cut gleaming in the light. "She could have been shot," he said quietly. "She almost was," the officer replied. Karen sat in the back of the SUV, trembling as Daniel approached. For the first time, she saw him clearly, not the quiet neighbor she'd imagined as a rule-breaker, but a man who carried himself with quiet strength, the kind of calm that came from years of discipline. He didn't yell or curse. He simply looked at her through the glass and said one sentence she'd never forget. "You went looking for control and found consequence." She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but no words came. That night, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. Lights glowed in every house, phones rang, and people whispered the same story. Karen, the HOA queen, had been arrested for breaking into a SWAT cabin. It sounded too unreal to believe, but the photos of police cars told the truth. Some people laughed quietly, others were just shocked. "She finally messed with the wrong person," one man said. Meanwhile, Daniel sat on his porch long after midnight, the forest alive with the sounds of crickets and wind through the branches. He held a mug of coffee, staring at the broken lock on his gate. He didn't feel anger, only a strange mix of disbelief and exhaustion. For years he had stayed quiet, thinking peace came from avoiding conflict. But now he saw that sometimes silence only invites arrogance. He looked up at the sky, the stars glimmering faintly through the trees, and whispered to himself, "She thinks this is over. But it's just beginning." The next morning, Karen was released with a warning pending investigation. She returned home humiliated but still stubborn. In her mind, she wasn't wrong. She was the victim of overreaction. She told her husband, "They'll see, I was only doing my job." But even as she said it, her voice shook. Across town, Daniel met with federal officials to finalize the incident report. They thanked him for his cooperation and assured him they'd handle the matter quietly. He nodded, shaking the officer's hand. "She'll try to spin this," Daniel said. "She always does." The officer smirked slightly. "Let her. The facts are louder." As Daniel drove back to his cabin, the morning light broke through the trees, painting gold across the gravel road. The gate was repaired now, a new lock in place. The woods were silent again, peaceful, but something had changed, not in the trees, not in the air, but in him. He had seen how far someone could go when blinded by power, and he knew that people like Karen never stop until someone stops them. He parked his car, stepped out, and looked at his cabin. For a long moment, he just stood there, breathing in the calm. Then he turned toward the forest and said quietly, "You wanted control, Karen. Now you'll see what happens when control disappears." And somewhere back in town, Karen sat at her kitchen table, staring at the HOA rulebook in her hands, trying to find comfort in the only thing she understood, rules. But no page could erase what had happened. The memory of those red laser dots on her chest, the shouts, the flashing lights, it haunted her every time she closed her eyes. For the first time in years, she realized she wasn't untouchable. And though she didn't know it yet, that single mistake, cutting one lock, had unlocked something much bigger. It had awakened a storm that would soon expose everything she had built her power on. And Daniel Harris was done staying silent. That evening the forest was filled with the echo of police radios and flashing red and blue lights cutting through the trees. The SWAT team was packing up their gear, the agents moving quickly but silently, while the air still buzzed with tension from what had happened only hours earlier. Daniel Harris drove up the long dirt road to his cabin, his headlights slicing through the dusk. The sight that greeted him was surreal. Yellow police tape stretched across his property, tire marks all over the gravel, and agents standing outside his broken gate. For a man who had built his life around quiet, seeing chaos invade his peace was something he'd never expected. As soon as he stepped out of his truck, the nearest officer approached him, recognition flashing in his eyes. "Mr. Harris," the officer said firmly, "we've contained the situation. You're cleared to approach." Daniel looked around slowly, his sharp eyes taking in the details. The snapped chain, the bolt cutters on the ground, the open cabin door, and then the woman sitting in the back of a police SUV with her head down. He didn't need to ask who she was. "What happened?" he asked quietly. The officer sighed, lowering his notepad. "Someone broke into your cabin during our training session. A civilian. Says she's from the HOA." Daniel's jaw tightened just slightly. "Karen Blake," he said under his breath. The officer nodded. "She's lucky she's alive. We thought she was an intruder. Could have gone bad real fast." Daniel walked slowly toward the gate, his boots crunching on the gravel, the cold wind brushing his face. The officers moved aside respectfully. Most of them knew who he was even before he introduced himself. He wasn't just another resident. He was a federal contractor and security consultant, one of the men who coordinated training programs for agencies like the SWAT unit now standing in his yard. His cabin had been cleared as an off-site tactical exercise zone, a temporary training location approved under federal authority. Everything had been planned and authorized properly. Everything, except for one arrogant intrusion that no one had seen coming. He stopped near the SUV, his calm eyes locking on Karen through the window. Her face was pale, her expression twisted with shock and embarrassment. The last time she saw him, she had written him a notice for trimming his trees too unevenly. Now she couldn't even meet his gaze. The officer standing near the car spoke softly. "You know her?" Daniel nodded once. "She's the HOA president. Thinks she runs everything." The officer let out a quiet chuckle. "Well, tonight she ran into the wrong property." Daniel didn't smile. He wasn't amused. He just stared at her for a long moment before saying, "You could have killed her." The officer frowned. "She's the one who cut your lock. Walked right into an armed operation. She's lucky one of my guys noticed her hands were empty before reacting." Daniel's face remained unreadable, but his voice dropped lower. "She doesn't understand danger. She only understands control." The officer nodded slowly. "We'll file an incident report. You'll be notified if the investigation continues." When the flashing lights faded and the vehicles began to leave one by one, Daniel stood alone in front of his gate. The night air was cold, and the faint sound of frogs croaked near the lake behind his cabin. The forest seemed to have swallowed all the noise, leaving only silence and shame hanging in the air. Karen's car drove off slowly, escorted by a county deputy, the reflection of her red brake lights vanishing into the darkness. Daniel stayed there for a long moment, hands in his pockets, his breath visible in the cool air. Finally, he whispered to himself, "She crossed a line she can't uncross." The next morning, the sun rose slowly over Oak Ridge Estates, painting the homes gold and warm. But there was no warmth in the stares that followed Karen when she stepped out of her car. Neighbors peeked through blinds, pretending not to watch. Everyone had heard what happened. The HOA president arrested for trespassing during a federal operation. Some didn't believe it at first, but by morning, the photos were already circulating online. The image of her standing beside police vehicles, her face red and furious, had become the talk of the neighborhood. Her husband didn't speak a word to her that morning. He just sat at the table, sipping his coffee, pretending the newspaper was more interesting than his wife's humiliation. She slammed her cup down and snapped, "It was a misunderstanding." He didn't look up. "You cut a federal lock," he said quietly. "What did you think was going to happen?" She stormed out of the house, her pride louder than her fear, determined to take control of the situation before it spiraled out of her hands. By the time she reached the HOA office, her anger had turned into a plan. She printed a new violation letter, stamped it with the board seal, and drove straight back to Daniel's property. When she arrived, the fresh lock was already in place. She taped the notice right to the gate. Violation of HOA Section 9A, unauthorized structure use, fined $500. She smiled to herself, muttering, "Let's see how untouchable you really are." She drove off before anyone saw her, feeling the brief thrill of power she had lost the night before. But what she didn't know was that Daniel was already watching from the woods, quiet and unseen. He stood beside a tree, his arms crossed, eyes following her SUV until it disappeared down the road. He didn't tear down the notice. He just took a photo of it. Evidence, he thought. That afternoon, he drove into town to meet with the federal liaison assigned to the training operations. The man listened carefully as Daniel described what had happened, reviewing the security footage and police report. When he finished, the liaison leaned back in his chair. "We'll handle this," he said. "She interfered with a restricted zone. There will be consequences." Daniel shook his head. "Let me deal with her. The law will take care of itself. I just want her to understand something. That power isn't protection." The man nodded, respecting his calm. "You always were patient, Daniel. Maybe too patient." When he returned home that evening, the wind had picked up. The trees swayed, the cabin lights flickered, and the world looked different now, quieter but heavier, like something was waiting to happen. He sat on his porch, the same porch Karen had called unsightly in one of her past reports, and stared at the paper she had taped to his gate. It fluttered in the wind, the ink smudged from the morning dew. He could have ripped it down, but he didn't. Instead, he smiled faintly. "Let her think she's still winning," he whispered. "It'll make the fall harder." That night, Karen sat at her desk surrounded by paperwork. Her phone buzzed constantly with calls from angry residents and reporters asking about the incident. She ignored them all. Her pride wouldn't let her admit what happened. Instead, she began rewriting the narrative. In her new version of the story, she was the victim. She had accidentally entered an unmarked training site and was mistreated by aggressive officers. She even planned to bring it up at the next HOA meeting, twisting the truth until people pitied her. But she underestimated how fast the truth travels when it's recorded on a dozen police body cameras. The next morning, Daniel received an email from a local journalist who had gotten hold of the report. "Mr. Harris, can you confirm that the HOA president broke into your property during a SWAT operation?" Daniel didn't reply. He simply forwarded the message to the county office. Let them handle the noise. He had no interest in publicity. His war wasn't in headlines, it was in patience. A few days later, when Karen passed by his gate again, she found something that made her stop cold. Her violation notice was still hanging there, but now there was another paper pinned directly beside it. The Federal Incident Report, stamped and signed by law enforcement, detailing her unauthorized entry, her trespassing charge, and her interference with federal activity. The heading read, "Official Notice, Restricted Area Breach, Subject Identified as HOA President Karen Blake." Her face drained of color. She tore the papers down angrily, ripping them to shreds, but the damage was already done. Every neighbor who passed by had seen them. Daniel, standing inside his cabin window, watched her from a distance, calm and silent. He didn't gloat or smile. He simply whispered, "You still don't get it. It's not about rules anymore, it's about respect." He turned away from the window, poured himself a cup of coffee, and sat at his desk to begin what he knew would be a long process. He started writing his report, documenting every violation, every fine, every threat she had sent him over the years. He saved each one in a folder named simply Accountability. Outside, the wind blew harder, carrying with it the faint sound of leaves scraping across the road. The storm hadn't ended. It was only beginning, and for the first time in her life, Karen Blake wasn't the one holding the clipboard, she was the one being watched. The morning after Karen found the report posted beside her violation notice, Oak Ridge Estates buzzed with gossip like never before. The story had spread through every porch, every phone call, and every whispering group gathered at mailboxes. Neighbors who once feared Karen now laughed quietly behind curtains, watching the woman who once ruled their lives crumble under the weight of her own arrogance. But Karen wasn't ready to surrender her crown. She was humiliated, furious, and burning with the kind of rage that only pride could feed. She sat in her office that morning, tapping her manicured nails on the desk, her mind racing with one thought: he's trying to destroy me. In her eyes, Daniel wasn't a victim, he was a problem. And Karen didn't tolerate problems. By noon, she had called an emergency HOA board meeting. The small office filled with uneasy board members, most of whom didn't want to be there. They had seen the news, heard the laughter, and read the report that exposed her trespassing. Yet when Karen entered, wearing her blazer and that same confident smirk, they straightened in their seats as if she still held power over them. She slammed a folder onto the table and declared, "Daniel Harris has violated multiple HOA regulations, including security restrictions and unreported property usage." Her voice was sharp, echoing off the walls. Greg, the board treasurer, cleared his throat. "Karen, maybe this isn't the right time," she cut in. He embarrassed this association. He posted confidential reports in public view. That's a violation of Section 10A. The others exchanged glances. One woman spoke softly, "Karen, everyone saw what happened. You broke into his cabin during a federal operation. Maybe it's best to let this go." Karen's eyes narrowed. Let it go? If we let him get away with this, what's next? People building whatever they want? Locking out the HOA? No. We make an example out of him. The room fell silent. Most of them didn't agree, but no one dared oppose her outright. She had bullied them all for years, with rules, with threats, with her voice. So the board reluctantly nodded as she drafted a motion for fines and penalties against Daniel. Within hours, Daniel's gate once again bore the mark of her obsession. A bright yellow notice reading, "Immediate violation, HOA rules breach, hearing scheduled." When he found it that evening, Daniel didn't even sigh. He simply peeled it off slowly, folded it neatly, and placed it on his kitchen table beside a growing stack of similar papers. His expression was calm, his eyes tired but sharp. He'd seen this kind of behavior before, the desperate kind that comes when people lose control and try to claw it back. He made himself a cup of coffee, sat by the window, and watched the last light fade from the forest. "You still don't get it, Karen," he whispered. "This isn't a game you can win." But Karen believed she could. She began spreading stories through the neighborhood, telling anyone who would listen that Daniel was under investigation, that his cabin was being used for suspicious activity, that the whole SWAT story was a cover-up. She held her head high at every HOA gathering, pretending to be the victim. Some believed her lies, but most didn't. Still, she couldn't let it go. She filed complaint after complaint, noise, structure modification, failure to maintain community harmony. Each one more absurd than the last. It was harassment disguised as bureaucracy. But what she didn't know was that her every move was now being watched, recorded, and documented not just by Daniel but by the very people she thought she controlled. A week later, Daniel's neighbor, Mrs. Cole, knocked on his door. She was in her 60s, kind-eyed, and one of the few who had always greeted him kindly. "Daniel," she said softly, holding a piece of paper, "Karen's been going door to door again. She's telling people you brought dangerous people into the neighborhood." He looked at the paper, another HOA memo written in Karen's sharp handwriting. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that held more pity than anger. "Thank you, Mrs. Cole," he said gently. "Don't worry. I know how to handle this." She nodded, relief in her eyes, before walking away. Daniel stood there for a moment, the paper fluttering in his hand, the woods behind him whispering softly in the evening wind. He could have fought her the way she fought others, loudly, publicly, cruelly. But that wasn't his way. He had something far stronger than her clipboard. He had truth. That night, Karen sat in her living room surrounded by paperwork, half-empty coffee cups, and the glow of her laptop screen. She was drafting a full HOA report against Daniel, typing furiously, her anger spilling into every word. "Unauthorized property use," she muttered as she wrote. "Failure to comply with inspections." She added made-up details, twisting half-truths into accusations. Her hands shook with adrenaline. "He thinks he can humiliate me? Let's see how he handles this." When she finished, she saved the document and emailed it to the board, marking it urgent. But as soon as she hit send, her phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number: "Stop before you make things worse." Her heart skipped. She stared at the screen, the message unsigned, the sender hidden. For the first time, she felt a flicker of fear. Was it Daniel? Was it someone from the federal agency she'd angered? She didn't know, and the not knowing made it worse. She deleted the message, convincing herself it meant nothing, but the thought lingered like a shadow in the back of her mind. The next morning, she strutted into the HOA meeting room ready to announce her new motion. The board members looked uneasy, their voices low. Greg handed her a folder. "Before you start," he said nervously, "you should see this." Inside were screenshots, copies of the official federal report about her intrusion. It had leaked online, complete with her photo and name. She froze, her fingers tightening around the folder. The article headline glared at her like fire: "HOA President under review for interfering in federal operation." Her knees felt weak, but she forced a laugh. "Fake news," she said. "You think I care about gossip?" No one laughed with her. The silence was louder than any answer. Across the street, Daniel watched from his porch as a few board members left her house that afternoon, their faces pale and serious. He knew what that meant. The HOA was cracking from the inside. Still, he said nothing. He didn't have to. The truth was working quietly, doing what it always did, dismantling lies piece by piece. That evening, he sat in his cabin, writing a letter of his own, calm, professional, and factual. It detailed every harassment notice, every illegal fine, and every personal threat Karen had issued. It wasn't a complaint. It was a record, the kind of record that could turn into a lawsuit if needed. When he finished, he sealed the envelope and addressed it to the county inspector's office. Meanwhile, Karen paced in her kitchen, the weight of fear pressing heavier with each hour. Her phone rang non-stop, reporters, angry homeowners, even board members resigning one by one. Her husband tried to calm her, but she snapped, "They're all turning against me." He looked at her quietly and said, "No, Karen. You turned them against yourself." She froze, her throat dry, her pride unraveling. Outside, the sound of thunder rolled through the distance, and rain began to fall, tapping softly on the window. She sank into her chair, staring blankly at her reflection in the dark glass. The woman who once controlled every inch of Oak Ridge Estates was now trapped in the one thing she could never control, the consequences of her own actions. And somewhere, across the rain-soaked trees, Daniel sat calmly in his cabin, listening to the storm. He didn't celebrate. He didn't feel joy. He simply leaned back in his chair and whispered to himself, "When you build your world on fear, it only takes one truth to make it fall apart." The storm that night didn't just rattle windows. It marked the beginning of something much bigger. The next morning, the entire Oak Ridge community woke up to official letters stamped with the county seal. Each envelope carried the same message: an investigation has been opened into the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association and its leadership practices. The news spread like fire. For years, people had whispered complaints about Karen Blake and her obsession with control, but now someone had finally listened. Some said Daniel had filed it. Others thought the government had stepped in after the SWAT incident. Whatever the truth was, the result was the same. Karen's kingdom was falling. Karen sat at her dining table when the mailman dropped the envelope through the slot. Her hands trembled as she tore it open. The words hit her like cold rain. Under review for potential misconduct, harassment, and misuse of authority. She dropped the letter on the table, her chest tightening. She couldn't breathe for a moment. This couldn't be happening, not to her. She had always been the one in charge, the one giving orders, not the one being investigated. She jumped from her chair, pacing the room, mumbling to herself. "It's him," she hissed. "Daniel did this. He's trying to destroy me." Her husband looked up from the newspaper and said quietly, "Karen, you destroyed yourself." She ignored him. She grabbed her phone, calling board members one by one, but no one picked up. Some calls went straight to voicemail, others were declined. The silence was deafening. The people who had once feared her were now afraid to be near her. By afternoon, a black county SUV pulled up in front of her house. Two investigators stepped out, both wearing plain suits and carrying files. Karen froze when they knocked. "Mrs. Blake," one asked politely. "We're here to discuss the ongoing inquiry into HOA practices. May we come in?" She forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, officers. I'm happy to help." Inside, they sat at her kitchen table, their voices calm but firm. "We've received multiple reports of misconduct," one said. "Unlawful fines, harassment, selective enforcement, unauthorized use of funds." Karen's mouth went dry. "That's absurd," she said quickly. "These are lies. My duty was to protect the community." The investigator flipped through his folder and slid a photo toward her. A screenshot from a SWAT bodycam showing her standing in Daniel's cabin, bolt cutters in hand, the laser dots on her chest. "Was this also protecting the community?" he asked quietly. She stared at the photo, her lips parting but no sound coming out. That was a misunderstanding," she stammered. "I was ensuring compliance. He was violating rules." The investigator leaned back, unimpressed. "The property was under federal lease. You had no jurisdiction." His tone was factual, not cruel, but each word felt like a knife. Meanwhile, Daniel received his own letter that day, not a warning, but a thank you. It came from the county legal office, acknowledging his cooperation and evidence submission. They were using his documentation, the photos, the messages, the notices she'd sent, as part of the investigation. He read it once, then folded it neatly and placed it on his desk. He didn't smile or gloat. He simply whispered, "It's about time." Later that evening, he watched from his porch as Karen's car sped down the road, heading toward the HOA office in a panic. She still thought she could fix this, control it, twist the truth one last time. But Daniel knew better. He had seen too many people try to outrun their own lies. They always tripped before the finish line. Inside the HOA office, Karen slammed the door open and startled the few remaining board members who hadn't resigned. "We have to fight this," she shouted, her voice cracking. "We're being targeted by a vindictive resident." Greg, the treasurer, looked exhausted. "Karen, please. They found inconsistencies in our finances. They said some expenses can't be accounted for." "That's nonsense," she snapped. "Those were legitimate reimbursements." "For what?" he asked quietly. She froze. "Community improvement," she muttered. "They said the receipts show a personal spa membership," he said flatly. Karen's face turned pale. "It was stress therapy," she shouted. "You wouldn't understand the pressure I deal with." Greg stood slowly. "No, Karen, I understand it perfectly. You wanted control. And now it's gone." He walked out, leaving her standing alone in the empty office, surrounded by files, her reflection staring back from the dark glass of the window. That night, the inspectors returned, this time to the HOA's storage room. They catalogued documents, photographed files, and sealed boxes of financial records. One of them paused by the door and said to the other, "You can always tell when someone's been in power too long. The paper trail always tells the truth." Karen watched from her car outside, gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "They can't take this from me," she whispered to herself. "I built this." Across the street, Daniel sat in his cabin, the glow from his fireplace flickering across the walls. He was reviewing a few last files, his notes precise and calm. He had spent years observing people in positions of power, some noble, some corrupt. They all had the same downfall, the belief that rules didn't apply to them. He thought about Karen, about the years she'd tormented others with petty fines and her need for control. Now the system she had used against others was closing in on her, and all he felt was a quiet, bittersweet satisfaction. Justice wasn't always loud. Sometimes it arrived quietly, with a stamp on a letter and a knock on a door. By the end of the week, the county announced an official audit of the HOA. Every resident received an email stating that all HOA activities were suspended pending investigation. The news rippled through the community like a wave. People cheered, some cried, others just felt relief. For the first time, the neighborhood was free from fear. No more surprise fines. No more late-night warnings about mailbox colors or lawn length. The air itself felt lighter. But Karen's nightmare was just beginning. Late one night, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "We need to talk. The auditors are expanding their scope." She stared at the message for a long time, her pulse quickening. Then another text arrived. "They're looking into personal transactions. We can't hide them anymore." It was from one of her former board members. Her breath caught. She looked around her house, the fancy furniture, the new kitchen appliances, the remodeled backyard, all of it funded partly through community improvement budgets. For the first time, she realized how far she had gone. Panic crept up her spine. "It wasn't supposed to go this way," she whispered. The next morning, the inspectors arrived again, this time with county officers. They didn't shout or threaten. They just handed her a notice and asked politely for her cooperation. One said, "We'll need access to your personal records for verification." Her hands trembled as she passed them her files. As they left, one officer turned to her gently. "It's always better to tell the truth now than to have it found later." When they drove away, she closed the door, leaned against it, and slid down until she was sitting on the floor. The silence in her house felt heavier than ever. Across the woods, Daniel sat by the window, watching the sunlight hit the trees. The chaos had finally started to slow, replaced by the kind of stillness that comes after a storm. He wasn't celebrating. He was thinking. People like Karen never understood peace. They only understood control. Maybe, he thought, losing everything was the only way she would ever learn. He picked up his coffee, took a slow sip, and whispered to himself, "Justice doesn't need noise. It just needs patience." The tension in Oak Ridge was so thick it felt like the air itself carried whispers. The investigation had shaken everything. Neighbors avoided eye contact with Karen, and once empty streets were suddenly alive with quiet conversations. People who used to nod politely at her now crossed the road to avoid confrontation. The HOA office that had once been a fortress of power now looked deserted, its blinds drawn, papers piling up on the desks inside. Karen sat inside that office on a gray morning, staring at the mirror on the wall across from her. Her reflection looked older, sharper, more desperate. Her perfectly pressed blazer couldn't hide the tremor in her hands or the hollow circles beneath her eyes. She kept whispering to herself, "It's just noise. I'll fix it. I fixed worse." But this time, her voice sounded uncertain. The board had called an emergency meeting that evening, and word had spread fast. The whole neighborhood planned to attend. For years, she'd ruled those meetings like a queen addressing her court. Tonight, she'd be standing in front of her people as a defendant. By evening, the small community hall was packed. Folding chairs scraped against the floor, murmurs filled the air, and the tension was electric. Every seat was taken, and even the walls seemed to hold their breath. Karen entered wearing her signature blue suit, her chin high, pretending she wasn't breaking inside. She placed her folder on the podium and cleared her throat. "Let's begin," she said sharply, trying to sound like the woman she once was. Greg, the treasurer, sat across the room, his face unreadable. The residents, a sea of familiar faces, stared at her in silence. Even the few who once supported her sat with crossed arms. "I've called this meeting to clear my name," she began. "There's been misinformation, lies, and slander spread about me and this association. I did what was necessary to keep this community safe, clean, and respected." Her words were confident, but her hands betrayed her, gripping the edges of the podium so tightly her knuckles turned white. An older man stood up from the back, his voice steady but tired. "Safe? You fined my wife for hanging a wind chime, Karen." Laughter and murmurs rippled through the room. She forced a smile. "Rules exist for a reason, Mr. Doyle." "Rules?" Another voice called out. "You used those rules to bully people, to threaten them, to take money that wasn't yours." The crowd stirred louder now, anger building like a wave. "I followed procedure," she said, raising her voice. "Every fine was legal, every decision voted by the board." Greg stood slowly, his voice cutting through the noise. "You mean the board you manipulated, the one you silenced when they disagreed with you?" Karen froze. "That's not true." He opened a folder and held up a paper. "Then maybe you can explain this," he said. "An expense report with your signature, $4,204 Community Wellness Consulting. That's a spa membership, Karen. Paid with HOA funds." Gasps filled the room. Karen's face flushed. "That's out of context," she stammered. "I was under stress. It was for health reasons." Greg set the paper down and looked at her sadly. "You fined a single mother $100 for painting her porch without permission, but you spent thousands on yourself. You've humiliated neighbors, lied to us, and now you expect us to believe you're the victim." Karen tried to speak, but the crowd was no longer listening. Someone shouted, "You broke into a man's house, Karen." Another voice followed, "You almost got shot." Her throat closed, the sound of their voices crashing over her. "That was a misunderstanding," she said weakly, but it only made things worse. The crowd erupted into angry murmurs, and for the first time, she realized they weren't afraid of her anymore. The fear that had once been her greatest weapon was gone. Then the doors at the back opened. Every head turned. Daniel Harris stepped inside, calm, quiet, and composed. His presence alone silenced the room. He didn't look angry. He didn't look smug. He just walked down the aisle with slow, deliberate steps, holding a folder under his arm. Karen's stomach twisted. "Mr. Harris," Greg said softly, almost relieved. Daniel nodded and turned toward the podium. Karen stepped back instinctively. "I think we've all heard enough," he said. His voice was calm, deep, the kind that didn't need to shout to command attention. "But before this goes any further, I'd like to share something." He opened his folder and placed several papers on the podium. "This," he said, "is the official report from the county investigation, and this one," he lifted another page, "is the federal documentation from the SWAT training operation." The room went silent, every whisper vanishing like smoke. "Karen Blake," he continued, looking her straight in the eye, "entered my property without permission during an active federal exercise. She cut my lock, ignored warning signs, and trespassed into a restricted area. The officers on site could have fired, but they didn't. She's lucky to be standing here tonight." Karen's lips parted, but no words came. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You called that an inspection," he said quietly. "But let's call it what it really was, abuse of power." He turned to face the crowd. "For years, you've all lived under fear. Every minor infraction became a battle. Every letter in your mailbox felt like a threat. That's not a community. That's control." His words hit like thunder. The audience sat frozen, the truth too heavy to ignore. "She thought she could find me, intimidate me, shame me," he said, "but she made one mistake. She crossed into a world she didn't understand." He set down the final page, a letter from the county office. "The HOA's finances are now under audit. The board will be restructured under state oversight. And as of tonight, Karen Blake is officially suspended from all duties pending legal review." The room exploded, not with violence, but with applause and shouts of relief. People stood up, clapping, some even cheering. After years of silence, they finally had their voices back. Karen stumbled backward, her face pale, her knees weak. "This isn't fair," she whispered, her voice drowned out by the noise. Daniel stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "Fairness," he said, "is finally catching up." She looked at him, eyes filled with disbelief. "You ruined me." He shook his head. "No, Karen. You did that all by yourself." He turned and walked out of the hall as the applause continued, the sound echoing behind him like the closing of a long, dark chapter. Karen stood alone at the podium, her papers scattered on the floor, her authority gone. The people she once ruled over now turned their backs and walked away, talking freely, laughing even. Greg approached her one last time and said quietly, "It's over, Karen. Let it go." Then he left her standing there, under the harsh fluorescent lights, the sound of her own breathing the only thing she could hear. Outside, the night was calm. The air smelled like pine and rain, the world quiet again after the storm inside. Daniel walked to his truck, stopping for a moment to look back at the hall. Through the window, he could still see Karen standing there, small, still, and finally powerless. He didn't feel joy, only relief. As he started his engine, the headlights lit up the road ahead, the forest whispering softly in the distance. For the first time in a long while, Oak Ridge didn't feel suffocating anymore. It felt alive, breathing again after years under her shadow. And as Daniel drove away into the quiet night, the sign by the entrance of the neighborhood seemed to glow in his headlights. "Welcome to Oak Ridge Estates, a community of neighbors." For once, it finally meant what it said. After the meeting, Oak Ridge Estates changed overnight. The power Karen once held like a crown was gone, and the people she had ruled through fear were finally free. For years, the neighborhood had lived under the weight of her rules, her voice on every note, her judgment behind every fine, but now her voice had gone silent. The next morning, the HOA office stood empty, its door wide open, files scattered across the desk like someone had left in a hurry. The new interim board, appointed by the county, moved in quickly, and the first thing they did was order a full audit of all accounts. What they found left everyone speechless. Thousands of dollars missing, checks written to fake companies, and community funds spent on Karen's personal luxuries, designer furniture, vacations, spa retreats, and even the car parked in her driveway. The truth spread faster than wildfire. By noon, every resident in Oak Ridge knew the woman who had once fined them for unapproved paint colors had been stealing their money all along. Karen sat in her house with the blinds closed, the sound of rain tapping against the window. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing all morning. Calls from reporters, angry homeowners, and the same county officials who had once treated her with respect. Now they wanted explanations. She stared at her reflection in the glass, pale and exhausted, her once perfect hair a tangled mess. She had built her life on control, but now she couldn't control anything. Not the investigation, not the rumors, not even her own trembling hands. She whispered to herself, "They won't believe it. They'll understand. I did it for them." But even as she said it, her voice broke. She knew the truth was already out of her hands. Across the woods, Daniel sat at his cabin table, reading the morning newspaper. The headline took up nearly half the front page: HOA president under criminal review, community funds misused. He set the paper down and sighed. There was no smile on his face, only quiet understanding. Justice didn't always come with cheering or applause. It came with truth. And truth had a way of crawling out from under every lie, no matter how deep someone tried to bury it. He stepped outside, feeling the cold wind brush against his face. For the first time in months, the neighborhood was peaceful. Children played in driveways, neighbors greeted each other again, and laughter, once forbidden, filled the air. But even with the calm, Daniel could sense the storm still circling somewhere behind it, the final consequence that hadn't yet arrived. That afternoon, Karen received a knock at her door. She hesitated, her heart pounding, before opening it. Two county officers stood there with serious faces. One handed her a letter. "Mrs. Blake," he said, "you're officially under formal investigation for HOA fund misuse and trespassing on federal property. You'll need to appear in court next week." Her breath caught, her fingers gripping the doorframe for balance. "There must be some mistake," she whispered, but they had already turned away. The letter trembled in her hands. It felt heavier than paper. It felt like judgment. She closed the door, locked it, and leaned against it, sliding down slowly until she sat on the floor. The silence of her home pressed against her ears. The walls, once symbols of her power, now felt like a cage. That night, she drove to the lake behind the community, where Daniel's cabin lights glowed softly across the water. She sat in her car, watching from a distance, thinking about how easily her world had fallen apart. All her rules, her warnings, her demands, none of it mattered anymore. The man she had tried to destroy had remained calm through it all, patient and strong, while her empire had burned down around her. She stepped out of the car, her heels sinking into the wet ground, and stood near the edge of the water, staring at her reflection. The moonlight made her look like a stranger. "I only wanted to make things better," she whispered to herself. But deep down, she knew she had wanted something else: power. And power, she had learned too late, always demands a price. The next morning, Daniel received a call from the county office. "Mr. Harris," the official said, "we wanted to inform you that the investigation is concluding soon. Your cooperation was invaluable. We'll be holding a hearing next week." "I'll be there," Daniel replied calmly. "But not for revenge. Just closure." The official paused, then said, "She's losing everything, you know. Her house, her title, her credibility." Daniel's voice remained steady. "Maybe that's what it takes for people like her to see what they've become." That evening, the sky over Oak Ridge turned golden as the sun dipped behind the trees. The neighborhood felt alive again, like a weight had been lifted. Neighbors gathered on porches, some for the first time in years, laughing and talking freely without worrying about fines or citations. The new HOA board announced a community rebuild program, focusing on repairs and goodwill rather than punishment. The sign at the entrance was repainted with fresh colors, "Welcome to Oak Ridge, a place of peace." People smiled when they saw it. For the first time, those words actually meant something. But Karen didn't attend the announcement. She was inside her house, packing her office into boxes. Every sound of tape tearing or paper shuffling echoed like thunder in her empty home. On her desk sat the HOA seal, the one she used to stamp every warning letter. She picked it up, stared at it, then set it down softly, her hands trembling. It had been her weapon, her identity. Now it was nothing more than a reminder. As she sealed the last box, she heard another knock at her door. When she opened it, Daniel was standing there. She froze, too stunned to speak. "Evening," he said quietly. She swallowed hard. "Why are you here?" He looked at her for a long moment. "To make sure you're okay," he said simply. She laughed bitterly. "You of all people care." "I don't hate you," he said. "I just wanted it to stop." She lowered her eyes. "It did. More than I ever wanted." He nodded slowly. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to start over. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the wind moving through the trees. She finally said, "You must feel proud." "No," he replied. "Just tired." Then he turned to leave. She called after him softly, "Daniel." He stopped but didn't turn around. "I'm sorry." The words were quiet but real. He gave a small nod, then walked back toward his truck, the headlights cutting through the fading light as he drove away. When the night finally settled, Karen stood at her window watching the dark road ahead, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. For the first time in years, there was no clipboard, no control, no power, just silence and truth. The lies had fallen away, and all that was left was the woman behind them. She sat down, closed her eyes, and let the quiet wash over her. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of laughter floated through the neighborhood. A sound she hadn't heard in so long that it made her smile, just a little. And in his cabin across the lake, Daniel poured himself a cup of coffee, staring out at the water. The world was calm again, but he knew peace was fragile. It needed honesty to survive. He thought about Karen, about how easily power could turn into poison, and whispered to himself, "It's finally over." But deep inside, he also knew something else. Sometimes justice isn't about punishment. It's about letting truth unfold until it changes everything. Weeks passed, and the chaos that had shaken Oak Ridge slowly faded into quiet peace. The heavy clouds of tension that once hovered over every house finally cleared, replaced by a calm that people could feel in the air. For the first time in years, no one feared checking their mailboxes. There were no red-stamped warnings, no sudden fines, no suspicious HOA patrols creeping through the streets at night. The community that had once been divided by control and fear was finally breathing again. Children played freely on driveways that had once been considered too noisy. Families sat outside on their porches, and neighbors, who hadn't spoken in years, started sharing stories and laughter again. The sound of life had returned, soft and beautiful, like a melody that had been missing for too long. Daniel Harris became a quiet symbol of that change, though he never asked for it. He went back to his ordinary routines, working in his workshop, tending to his garden, and visiting the new HOA meetings as just another resident. The new board, humble and transparent, sought his advice when needed, but Daniel preferred to stay out of the spotlight. He didn't want praise or recognition. All he wanted was peace. He had learned long ago that real strength doesn't come from standing over others. It comes from standing firm for what's right, even when no one's watching. Every evening, he'd sit on his porch, looking at the quiet woods, hearing the laughter echo faintly from the neighborhood beyond the trees. He'd sip his coffee and smile faintly, content with the silence that used to mean isolation but now meant harmony. Karen Blake, on the other hand, lived a very different kind of silence. Her house stood at the edge of the community like a ghost from a forgotten time. The once pristine garden was overgrown, the HOA president's sign by her walkway long gone. Most of the neighbors avoided looking her way, not out of hatred, but pity. She had lost everything, her position, her respect, and the illusion of power she once wrapped herself in like armor. But sometimes, late at night, A few neighbors saw her sitting on her porch, no longer dressed in perfect suits, just quiet, still, and human. Some said she talked softly to herself. Others said she simply stared into the distance, listening to the sounds she used to silence. Children laughing, dogs barking, wind chimes swaying in the breeze. Perhaps those sounds haunted her. Perhaps they healed her. No one really knew. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky orange and gold, Daniel decided to take a walk through the neighborhood. It had been months since the storm of investigations, and the world felt fresh again. He passed families planting flowers, kids riding bicycles, and couples waving as he walked by. Every face he saw reminded him that peace, once broken, can still be rebuilt if people are brave enough to stand up for it. As he reached the corner near Karen's house, he saw her sitting alone, staring at the sunset. She looked up when she noticed him and hesitated, unsure if she should speak. Daniel gave her a polite nod. To his surprise, she spoke first, her voice soft and tired. "It's beautiful again," she said, looking at the street lined with blooming flowers. "It always was," Daniel replied quietly. "You just couldn't see it before." She smiled faintly, a sad, fragile smile. "I was wrong," she said after a long pause. "About everything. I thought rules would make people respect me. But all I did was make them afraid." Daniel looked at her, the same calm in his eyes as always. "Fear is easy," he said. "Respect is earned." She nodded slowly, her eyes glistening in the fading light. "I lost everything trying to control what was never mine," she whispered. "And now I don't even know who I am without it." Daniel looked out at the horizon, where the sun was sinking behind the trees. "You're still someone," he said. "Start by being human again." His words hung in the air like the last ray of sunlight, quiet and gentle. She didn't respond, but the tears that rolled down her cheeks said everything. He turned to walk away, and for the first time, she didn't feel resentment. She felt something else. Relief. That night, as darkness settled over Oak Ridge, the streetlights flickered on one by one, casting a soft golden glow across the calm streets. The new HOA board had arranged a small neighborhood gathering at the park, a celebration of unity. People brought food, shared laughter, and told stories about how things used to be. Daniel arrived late, quietly joining the crowd. When some neighbors spotted him, they clapped, not to glorify him, but to thank him. He smiled humbly, shaking hands and greeting them warmly. The new HOA president, a kind woman named Linda, stood up and said, "This community almost fell apart because of fear, but it stood back up because of truth. Let's never forget that." The crowd cheered, and Daniel felt something warm inside his chest. Hope. As the night grew darker, music played softly under the stars. Daniel looked around and saw people talking freely, children chasing fireflies, and for the first time, even Karen walking quietly along the edge of the park, watching from afar. She didn't join, but she smiled faintly as she listened to the sound of happiness she once tried to control. Maybe that was her punishment. Maybe that was her healing. Later, Daniel returned to his cabin, the moonlight reflecting off the calm water of the lake. He sat down on the porch, feeling the cool night air brush against his face. Across the lake, the community lights glowed like stars on earth. He thought about how everything had changed, how one act of arrogance had set off a chain of events that exposed every hidden truth. But more than that, he thought about how peace had returned, not through anger or revenge, but through patience and truth. He whispered to himself, "It's strange how silence feels different now." The crickets chirped in reply, the soft sound of life filling the woods once more. As he leaned back and looked up at the stars, a small smile crossed his face. The fight was over. The rules had fallen. The community had healed. And in that quiet peace, Daniel knew that the greatest victories are the ones that don't need celebration. They just need understanding. He closed his eyes and listened to the wind move through the trees, carrying with it the sound of laughter from far away. Oak Ridge was finally free, and justice had done its work. Not loudly, not cruelly, but completely. And in that still night, Daniel Harris finally rested, knowing the storm had passed, and peace had found its way home again.